Okay, next we will do a salute to the flag, and Commissioner Funes, can you have that, please?
All right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next, we have approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Okay, any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Next, we'll move on to approval of the minutes for November 28th, 2017.
So moved. Second.
Okay, any discussion? All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Next, we'll move on to public comment. And I have Ms. Tammy Holt still.
Good evening, Tammy Holt still, Lemon Valley Swan Lake Recovery Committee. The water's still there, so I'm still here. I'd like to start off by reminding the board, which you guys already know, based on the NRS, you guys are the mothership for the regional planning, and maybe it's time as a board, not being individual cities and county, but work together for a real regional plan. Things like Stonegate right now, when there's already too much traffic, Trick being way out where it's at, having houses in the north, Trick over on the east, the planning's not there. I've also noticed, I haven't been downtown Sparks much, but from what I have seen, you guys have been doing a lot of different things that have been really neat. Reno, there's still a lot of downtown areas that could be made into apartments that are abandoned buildings and stuff. And those are the things that need to be looked at for true housing. Right now, the developments that are coming up are developments that are set for $300,000 or higher. And the average person for what we have out in our area right now makes about $13.95 to $14 an hour. They cannot afford a $300,000 home. They can't afford the apartments that are out there. I think it's time to look at doing and setting up some kind of policy like New York and some of the other places as far as the rent mongers who are upping the rent on the apartments so people can't afford to stay in the apartments. It's got to stop. And it has to start with you guys. It has to start from the top and work down. And we really need for there to be a change so that Lemon Valley and what's happened with the flooding in the North Valley stops. You got Tama trying to do replenishing wells, but they didn't do the science behind it. They didn't do lateral tests. They didn't do any type of communication. So they don't know if the aquifers are set up to feed over there. And that could be one of the reasons why that lake's not going down, because Golden Valley was overcharged in 2016. So there's a lot of reasons that things need to be looked at, because stormwater runoff, aquifers being overfilled, and affluent waters being put into a closed basin aren't going to work. We need differences. We need to start thinking outside the box how to fix this, because it can't stay the way it's going. Putting over 2 million gallons of water from the city of Reno into that lake and almost 1 million gallons from Washoe County, that's 3 million gallons a day, and sometimes it's more. And I've taken measurements of the water runoff coming off of both sides going into the lake. And in November 16th, both areas were running about 3 feet in height in those big culverts. That's all. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, the bell didn't go off, and I was going to let you continue. I apologize. Thank you. Okay, next we'll move to business of the day. For possible action, public hearing, regional plan conformance review, City of Reno Master Plan Amendment, McCarran Sutro CR 17-011. And before you do your presentation, if any of the commissioners, I'm going to call for disclosures on all agenda items tonight, so does anybody have any disclosures? Okay, thank you.
All right. Evening, Commissioners. Chris Tolley, TMRPA for the record. This is an amendment to the City of Reno Master Plan from mixed residential to urban residential / commercial. The site is 7.61 acres, is located at the northeast corner of the North McCarran Boulevard and Sutro Street intersection. So that covers the first two bullets. And the essential change here is the entire parcel is proposed to be urban residential / commercial. And then here is a look at the subject property with a crosshatch. And this is near the UNR Regional Center, which would be at the lower left, as you can see the highlight there, but the crosshatch for that area doesn't show quite as clearly. Then it moved to an aerial from 2013, so it does show the construction on, I think it's 4 of the 5 parcels. And then the Tama facility in the upper left-hand corner of the subject site is not shown on this 2013 aerial, but does exist. So then to cover the review criteria, so this is policy 4.1.3 of the regional plan. It identifies 6 factors that the RPC must consider when evaluating the conformance of an amendment to a master plan: regional form and pattern, infill housing, jobs housing balance, public services and infrastructure, development constraints, military installations, and cumulative and indirect effects. And just to summarize some of the primary evaluation pieces in the staff report. Per the regional plan, the proposed uses are allowed in the Truckee Meadows service area and may support the neighboring UNR Regional Center through providing commercial services and housing. And then any specific development proposal would be analyzed through the City of Reno to determine whether existing infrastructure improvements or relocations would be necessary prior to the establishment or intensification of a new use. So in relation to the goals and policies of the regional plan, staff has not identified any significant conformance issues with the proposed project and recommends approval based on consistency and or compatibility with the factors listed in this policy. And then hopefully you can see it on one of the two on this screen over here. So you can find the suggested motion on the screen or on page 8 of your packet. This does conclude staff's presentation for this item. I will be available for any questions if there are any.
Terrific, thank you. This is a public hearing, and do I have any requests to speak, or would anybody like to speak on this agenda item?
Not this time.
Perfect, thank you. With that, I'm going to close the public hearing and bring it back to the board. Any questions, comments? Motion?
Madam Chair,
Yes, Commissioner Tessie.
I move to find the McCarran-Sutro amendment to the City of Reno Master Plan in conformance with 2012 Truckee Meadows Regional Plan based on the findings listed in the staff report.
Second, Commissioner Lyson.
I have a first and a second. Any discussion? Okay, hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you, motion carries. Next we'll move along to the public hearing item, Regional Plan Conformance Review, City of Sparks Comprehensive Plan Amendment for 500 Highland Ranch Parkway, CR 17-012. And again, I'll call for disclosures. Anybody spoken to anybody? Without a disclosure, I spoke to the applicant's representative, Mr. Gordon.
Right, again, evening, Chris Tolley, Team RPA. So this is an amendment to the City of Sparks Comprehensive Plan from open space to commercial to commercial. The 67.4 acre site is located at 500 Highland Ranch Parkway. And then, so I covered the first 2 bullet points here. The essential change is the entire parcel is proposed to be designated commercial. And then a slope analysis will be required to define the developable area before there can be any development on the site. So that's kind of a sub-note. And then here we can actually see in City of Sparks limits, and it looks either purple or brownish, depending on which one you're looking at. And then the DCA area is the darker color. You can see that on the subject site, which is in space. Then an aerial, again, these are from 2013. And then also an aerial with the slope. So we'll go ahead and go to review criteria. So this is the same as the previous item. Policy 4.1.3 of the regional plan identifies the 6 factors must be considered by the RPC: regional forming pattern, infill, housing, jobs, housing balance, public services and infrastructure, development constraints, military installations, and cumulative indirect effects. And then summarizing some of the primary evaluation pieces. Per the regional plan, proposed use is allowed in Sparks' Truckee Meadows service area. Corresponding development agreement requiring incorporation into Sparks' impact fee service area number 1 will allow staff to address concurrency with the development of the site by contributing to the cost of necessary public services and facilities. Portion of the site, as was discussed before, is considered development constrained for slopes greater than 30% for the regional plan. And a slope analysis will be required, again, to define the developable area before there can be any development on the site. So, in relation to the goals and policies of the regional plan, staff has not identified any significant conformance issues with the proposed project and recommends approval based on consistency and/or compatibility with the factors listed in this policy. So again, on the screen, you can find suggested motion, or it's on page 23 of your packet. But this does conclude staff's presentation, and I'll be available for any questions if there are any.
Thank you. Ron.
God doesn't want me to speak.
This is a public hearing, and I do have a request to speak. Garrett Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Garrett Gordon, representing the property owner. For the Sparks Commissioners, you're familiar with this application. Glad to be here before you and urge your support. I just wanted to correct one thing on the record is a slope analysis has been submitted and was approved by staff for approximately 36 acres of developable property. So that's been done, complete, and I'm here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, is there anybody else who have any other requests to speak?
I have none at this time.
Okay, great. I'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission. Any comments, questions?
Comment. Commissioner Hawkins,
Yes, Commissioner Hawkins.
we clarified that we're taking open space, how much open space is being converted?
Give me just a second. So there's 53.1 existing acres of open space, and then it's going to be proposed to 0.
So we're taking away all our open space out of it?
The designated, yes, designated open space. I don't know if parents here to, okay.
Commissioner Hawkins, do you want City of Sparks staff? Do you want to ask them a question? Or
I'd like the same answer, or a different answer. That's what I'm getting right now, is that I'm a proponent of open space. Always have been. And convert open space into buildable space just digs deep into my soul.
Ms. Melby, can you come out and address that, please? Thank you.
Good evening, Karen Melby. I'm the Development Services Manager for the City of Sparks. To answer your question, we were concerned about that issue too. But our code, our zoning code, which is something that the regional planning cannot look at really, they only look at the master plan or our comprehensive plan, will require them to do with the development, they will have to do a slope analysis. And with that review of that project, we will restrict the development in the steep areas. We will only allow construction or development on the developable areas, which would be less than 30% slopes for sure.
Is that 4-1, 5-1 on the slopes?
It's 30%. I'm not sure how that relates, what the correlation is on that.
Is it? Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Commissioner Gower?
Madam Chair, just a comment. Chris, you put up a map during your presentation and it had the aerial image and the overlay of the DCA with the slopes. And my comment is, yeah, I mean, you can put it back up. I'm just going to make a comment. It related to finding 2 that we have to make related to slopes and development constrained areas. I think it would be helpful to have that type of map in the staff report ahead of time so we can see it. So that was just what my comment was.
Cool. Thank you.
Madam
Thank
Chair,
you. Commissioner Weisky?
Chris, if one of our policies is to preserve open space, and we're voting tonight to take it all away, how did you make the finding to get rid of all the open space?
I
mean, I couldn't find anything to support it in your report.
So this is, I mean, as far as the findings that are contained in like the development constraints section, this really is looking at the fact that the portions of the property that are encumbered by the 30% or greater slopes, if I can go back to the slide, would be, would not be developed. And then there's also, I believe it's, I don't know if this is a part of Sparks' code or if it is just part of their policy of the comp plan. And that is a 2-to-1 ratio of preservation. So if they were to, this is reflected in the regional plan, or presented in the regional plan, reflected in their plan, that if they did develop this, that they would require a preservation of a 2-to-1 ratio. So anything that was touched in the DCA area would have to be preserved at a 2-to-1 ratio, if that makes any sense. So that's kind of the rationale as far as open space. It's still being preserved, but not necessarily in the same.
Ms. Robinson?
Madam Chair, if I may, one of the items that we certainly discussed in this particular review is the fact that at the moment, this actually has commercial and open space on it. The other corners of that particular space or that particular place are also commercial or mixed use. So the expectation is already set that there is development around that particular piece. That is that we heavily in the conversation around whether or not to go ahead and say yes to more commercial on a site that already has some identified.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Yeah, Commissioner Trevillick.
Yes, just for clarification, Chris, I thought you said that the open space would go to 0.
So existing is 53.01. And then as far as land use designations are concerned, then the open space designation would not exist on this site anymore.
Except
all
for the
be-
constrained.
Except for the development's constrained areas.
And then what I think I'm hearing is that whether there is a slope analysis available or not. And have you seen this slope, the applicant's representative is saying that the slope analysis was presented and.
We'll have the City of
Got lots
Sparks,
of people
we'll have City of
voting.
Sparks staff. Let's have Ms. Melby.
Again, Karen Melby, Sparks Planning. There was a preliminary slope analysis submitted, but with the review of this project, we will require a conditional use permit for the slopes. So we will have to evaluate that, which will be going to our planning commission for a conditional use permit. In our table, in our zoning code, we have a breakdown depending on what slope area you're on and how much of that area can be disturbed. So we will be addressing that with the conditional use permit when we evaluate the slopes on this property. The policy at the City of Sparks is that our comprehensive plan designations follow property lines. And that is partly why, in this case, we will not have the open space. We're trying to keep it so that it goes to the property lines. But we will evaluate that with the conditional use permit for the slopes, and then also, depending on what type of use that they put on this property, it could be an administrative review or in addition, a conditional use permit. Does that address the concerns, or?
Ms. Robinson?
Yes.
So in terms of just following up with what Ms. Melby said, what we're talking about here is anything that's over 30% slope will not be built on. The expectation, again, my understanding in Sparks' code is that it's between 15 and 30%. There's only limited development that's allowed on that. So the conversation, there will be some open space, but I understand for clarity of mapping that it does follow the property lines in terms of the zoning. Or master plan, excuse me.
Madam Chair, a follow-up question. So-
Go ahead.
Okay. So for your conditional use permit, I'm just trying to visualize what this looks like, not sitting on the Sparks Planning Commission, but when you approve that, what does that look like on a map? Because in the city of Reno, it's essentially a polygon that shows open space. How do you designate that?
You mean when we review the conditional use permit?
Yeah, I mean, are you
They
essentially
will have to
saying-
provide a detailed slope map which follows our categories that are in our zoning code, the breakdown by category. And then they have to also present how much land is in each one of those categories. And then we have a calculation of how much, in our code, we have a calculation of how much area you can disturb within those areas. And then they have to provide with their plan, they have to provide what they're proposing to disturb in those areas. If we see a conflict, then we will work with them and make sure that they comply with our code. But we break it down, like 0 to, I'm sorry, but I can't remember exactly the breakdown, but it's like 0 to 10. How many acres are within that designation? 10 to 15, how much are in that? 15 to 20, how much is in that? So we would look at, and there's a percentage. As you escalate into a steeper slope, there's an amount of area that you can disturb. And you cannot disturb beyond that amount of area.
Madam Chair, I have a
Commissioner
question.
Hawkins?
The problem I have with that is by the time they do the slope analysis, all of a sudden, we're still in with no open space. It's gone, it's been rezoned. I've got a real problem with that until everything's done with the slope, looking at the slopes and where we're gonna go with that. To me, I'd like to see a continuance on this thing until we know what the slope analysis tells us, and then give the proper designation of open space without taking it all away.
This is not a zoning request. This is a
No.
comprehensive plan. This is a land use designation. And at this point, we do not have a project to look at. So we can't impose them to do a conditional use permit on the slopes until we have a project. And we cannot go forward with a project until we have the approval of the comprehensive plan amendment. So that puts
Commissioner Hawkins?
in the,
In the city of Sparks, anything that has a slope above 30% cannot be developed. So in essence, that 30% and above will continue to be open space.
it will be open space within their project. It won't be
Within
a
their
designation, will not be a designation on the land use map because we try and do those but 2 property lines. So there would not be a designation, but our zoning code will require them to not disturb those areas that are over 30%. And then there's a percentage. I think you only can do 3/4 of the area that's in the 25 to 30%. You only can do a portion of that. There's a proportional formula on how much area you can disturb. I apologize. I didn't think to bring the zoning code with me tonight.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair, can I just ask a clarification
Sure,
question?
Commissioner Gower.
So I'm looking at your conformance review checklist list. So I just want to make sure that we've got this right. So policy 2.2.1 is what we're looking at, right, related to DCAs and slopes. So to meet that criteria, the information that you received from City of Sparks and their policies that address slopes. They can't build on slopes. That's the finding that we're hinging on, right? It's
Yes.
not what Karen talked about, with zoning and all of that.
Right.
It's whether their master plan policies provide that protection of the DCA areas. Okay. Does regional planning require the designation of open space to meet that finding? So does the area have to be designated in a zoning map or a plan as open space to meet that finding? That's what I'm trying to say. We're still protecting the development constrained areas, it's just not being called open space on its own.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
so unfortunately, this one appears to have blown out
Okay.
with the power cut, but if you look behind you, what you see is the DCA slope is indeed identified on the map. It's, so anything that's 30% or over, this is how we capture this regional planning. The expectation is that we will still do that. So you can see right now kind of what's 30% or over on that particular site.
So for all, I mean, for planning purposes, it's not called open space on the map, but really it is open space because it's development constrained.
Yes.
Okay,
If we refer to it as development constraint, excuse me, Madam Chair.
Yes, correct.
and Chris, that's how you meant 2.2.1?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Yes, one more question.
Commissioner Hawkins?
Can we deed restrict what they find later on as a condition?
Commissioner Hawkins, this is a local government, this would be a local jurisdiction, this is not something regional. We have to fit within our goals and policies if it meets the regional plans.
And the answer I just received from legal is no.
Any other questions? Yeah, I'll entertain a motion.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a motion.
Commissioner Peterson?
I move to find that 500 Island Ranch Parkway amendment to the City of Sparks comprehensive plan is in conformance with the 2012 Truckee Meadows Regional Plan based on the findings listed in the staff report.
Second.
Okay, I have a first and a second. Any discussion? Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Commissioner Hawkins opposed.
Okay, thank you. Motion carries. Next, we move along to public hearing, regional plan conformance review, City of Sparks comprehensive plan amendment for ARC Health and Wellness, CR 18-001. Again, I'm going to call for disclosures. Does anybody talk to anybody? Okay, with that.
Madam Chair, if I may actually.
Yes.
So again, this one is not working. I hate to ask this with the planning commissioners to see the presentation. It is behind you. We're sorry about the awkwardness of that, but just to let you know, it is up behind you if you'd like to look at it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. For the record, Nate Kusha, TMRPA. So this agenda item requests amending the Sparks Comprehensive Land Use Designation from intermediate density residential to commercial to review for conformance. It can be found starting on page 33 of your packet. The 0.88 acre amendment is located at 1855 North McCarran Boulevard, as shown on the map overhead or on page 39 of your packet. The proposed project is located within Sparks portion of the TMSA. The amendment site is currently developed and is already served by existing facilities and services, and per the regional plan, no portion of the site is considered development constrained. In addition, this request is in line with the transitioning that is occurring in the area, and that parcels to the north side of the property, which also front North McCarran Boulevard, have recently been converted to the commercial land use designation as well. So you guys already know the conformance kind of requirements. Regional planning staff has found no significant conformance issues with this master plan amendment and recommend approval based on the findings listed in the staff report. With that, I conclude my presentation. I'm available for questions. Otherwise, the recommended motion can be found on page 36 of your packet.
Thank you. With that, it's a public hearing, and I'll open the public hearing. Are there any requests to speak? Okay, hearing none, I'll bring it back to the commission. Any discussion? Motion?
Madam Chair, Commissioner Chesney.
Commissioner Chesney?
I move to find the ARC Health and Wellness Amendment to the City of Sparks Comprehensive Plan in conformance with the 2012 Truckee Meadows Regional Plan based on the findings listed in the staff report.
Second.
Okay, I have a first and a second. Any discussion? Okay, hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you, motion carries. Next, we move along to public hearing, regional plan amendment, RPA 17-002. Again, I'll call for disclosures.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Weinske, I spoke with the applicant's representative today, or yesterday.
Okay. Anybody else?
Madam Chair, I spoke with the representative.
Okay, perfect.
Commissioner Galvez today.
Okay, great, and I have disclosure, I spoke with, the residents. I spoke to Mr. James, and then I also spoke to Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Lauren Knox, Regional Planning. This agenda item discusses the Steamboat Meadows TMSA amendment and can be found starting on page 45 of your packet. So before we get into the proposed amendment, I just want to provide a quick overview of the Truckee Meadows Service Area, or TMSA. Per the regional plan, the TMSA is defined as the areas within which municipal services and infrastructure will be provided. This includes high-intensity core areas and existing planned urban and suburban developments. The regional plan allows the TMSA to be amended to include new lands, remove land, or move lands from one jurisdiction to another. This can occur through a sponsorship by the local government or through a private property owner application request, which requires the RPC, this body, to sponsor the amendment. Additionally, there are policies within the regional plan and the Regional Planning Governing Board regulations on procedure that govern the process and requirements for TMSA amendments to occur. All right, so now let's move to the specific request. To provide some background, in June of 2017, staff received a private property owner application requesting an amendment to the TMSA. The application requests to amend the TMSA by transferring a site from the City of Reno TMSA to Washoe County's portion of the TMSA. Currently, this site is within Reno's sphere of influence and has not been annexed into the City of Reno. The site is about 83 acres total, and of that, only about 67.5 acres are considered developable due to the presence of development constraint area on the site. The identified development constraint area is an AE floodway, which follows the Steamboat Creek that traverses the site. And all in all, this amendment is really seeking to ultimately alter the jurisdictional authority of the site. Great, so let's take a look at the site. I know it's behind you, I apologize for that. But this map provides some context regionally and can be found on page 55 of your packet. As you can see, this site is located in the southern portion of the TMSA, south of Geiger Grid and Mount Rose Highway. And if we get in a little bit closer, you can see the site is east of South Virginia Street, which is Old Highway 395, and is directly adjacent to the existing Washoe County TMSA. This map is available on page 53 of your packet. I also want to point out that the original application did not contain one of the parcels on the eastern portion of the site. However, the application was amended to include the parcel, which is approximately 3 acres in size. I know you can't see it, but it's just right above the Steamboat Creek identifier right there. All right, so as you may remember, this item was brought before this body in August, in which the RPC chose to sponsor the amendment, which ultimately allowed staff to begin processing this amendment. As part of this process, this item was then transmitted to the affected local jurisdictions for an advisory recommendation. In this case, that was Washoe County and the City of Reno. So in terms of the advisory recommendations, the City of Reno City Council heard the item and voted to not support the amendment and instead support an effort for a joint plan or a more detailed analysis during the regional plan update about the property's appropriateness in the sphere of influence. The Washoe County Board of County Commission voted to support the amendment and would like to have a larger discussion regarding the TMSA capacity in the regional plan update. So following transmittal to the local governments with the information that staff has received from the applicant, the City of Reno, and from Washoe County, staff prepared an analysis of the amendment, which is the topic of this agenda item tonight. Staff is requesting RPC's recommendation to the governing board. And then following this item, it will then be heard by the Regional Planning Governing Board and is the final step in the TMSA amendment process. Before we get into the specific review factors, I just want to provide a quick overview of Washoe County's TMSA as it would pertain to this request, if it's approved. Policy 1.1.7.1 of the regional plan describes a calculation for determining the acreage allowance within each jurisdiction's portion of the TMSA. If the jurisdiction's portion of the TMSA is calculated is exhausted, policy 1.1.7.3 allows for development flexibility acreage. This was a one-time 640-acre allotment given to each jurisdiction. With this request, Washoe County is willing to utilize the development flexibility acreage as defined by policy 1.1.7.3. And per agency records, the allowed development flexibility acreage available to Washoe County at this time is about 165 acres. As stated earlier, the net acreage of this request is about 67.5 acres. Again, Washoe County is able and willing to utilize their TMSA capacity for this request, and if approved, Washoe County would have about 98 acres left for future use. All right, so in terms of the review, the RPGB Regulations on Procedure, Section 2B6, defines agreed upon criteria for which TMSA amendments are evaluated. Additionally, Policy 4.3.6 of the regional plan requires the factors listed on the slide overhead to be analyzed in regards to a regional plan amendment. As a tool to better analyze TMSA amendments, an evaluation matrix based on the evaluation criteria is used. The matrix really provides a score for TMSA amendments. This request resulted in a relatively high score due to the fact that the site is already within the TMSA and that this request will simply alter the jurisdiction on the property. Also, the criteria in the matrix and the review factors of policy 4.3.6 generally overlap. The full analysis was included as part of your staff report, but for this presentation, we're going to briefly touch on each of these topics. So for regional form and pattern, the site is currently within the TMSA and is essentially requesting to alter jurisdictions to be solely within Washoe County's purview. It's adjacent to existing TMSA boundary, Washoe County, and it's also directly adjacent to existing residential areas. In terms of the housing and jobs housing balance, the proposed site is directly adjacent to an existing residential area. Material submitted indicates that eventually the applicant would like to seek an additional residential development on the site. This would be a separate request at a later time, but it just provides some context. In terms of the jobs housing balance, since the site has been master planned with the city of Reno since 2002, staff does not anticipate a significant shift in the jobs housing balance. Again, this amendment is really seeking to alter jurisdiction on the site. Thus, the potential for development with this request would not alter significantly. So in terms of the availability, timing, and phasing of infrastructure, again, the site is within the TMSA, which means the area has been contemplated for municipal services and infrastructure. The site has been in the TMSA since the TMSA's inception, so that was in 2002. It's also adjacent to existing infrastructure and services. For water, the site is within the Steamboat Springs Water Works Incorporated service area per the Regional Water Management Plan, and the provider has indicated that they are willing to serve the site. For wastewater, the site is within the South Truckee Meadows Water Reclamation Facility service area, as indicated by the Regional Water Management Plan. Additionally, there are sewer pipes present on site. There are existing roadways adjacent to the site. If the site were to be developed, additional improvements may be required and would be reviewed at a later time in the development review process. Information provided by the Washoe County School District indicates that the site is currently served by Pleasant Valley Elementary School, DePauli Middle School, and DeMonte Ranch High School. Again, if the site were to be developed, school capacity would be reviewed at a later time in the development review process if a project were to move forward. So in terms of public service levels and fiscal impacts, again, the amendment is really seeking to change jurisdiction and is not anticipated to negatively impact service levels or affect the overall regional priorities for the provision of services. In terms of services on the site now, Washoe County already provides sewer service, surrounding roadways, Sheriff Service, and the Truckee Meadows Fire Protection District also serves the site. In terms of natural resources, the Steamboat Creek currently traverses the site. An AE floodway is associated with the creek, which is considered a development constraint area per the regional plan. Per regional plan policy 2.2.1, development is limited in the DCA areas. Also, as discussed in the regional water management plan, the channels and banks of the Steamboat Creek contain mercury. The mercury does not threaten drinking water. However, there are concerns regarding any stream restoration work that would happen in the future. Additionally, steamboat buckwheat, which is a federally endangered plant species, is located on site. It's important to point out that these natural resource constraints would be present and need to be dealt with if future development of the site occurs, regardless of whether or not this property is within the City of Reno or Washoe County's jurisdiction, which is what this amendment is ultimately considering. So the subject site is currently subject to cooperative planning, as it is within the City of Reno expanded sphere of influence 2002 to 2006, as depicted in map 7 of the regional plan and further defined in policy 4.2.4 of the regional plan. If this amendment is approved, the subject site will no longer be within the cooperative planning area. As discussed in policy 1.2.17 of the regional plan, lands added to Washoe County's portion of the TMSA after 2006 shall not be subject to cooperative planning process. From staff's review of cooperative planning in regards to this request, it's possible that removal of the land from a sphere of influence back to Washoe County was not contemplated in regards to the cooperative planning policies. We haven't had any requests like this in the past that are similar or have broached this topic. So any sort of larger conversation about cooperative planning, it's not agendized for tonight's meeting. However, we wanted to bring the potential removal to your attention. And then again, the TMSA evaluation criteria, as noted in section 2B6 of the RPGB regulations on procedure, and the 6 factors above were analyzed for this proposal, and staff recommends that the RPC recommend adoption to the Regional Planning Governing Board. A motion can be found overhead, as well as on page 52 of your packet. I am happy to answer any questions you have. We also have the applicant's representative, City of Reno staff, and Washoe County staff available.
Thank you. With this, it's a public hearing, and I'm going to open the public hearing. And want to stress that all we are discussing is moving this from City of Reno into Washoe County. That's all that's being discussed tonight, nothing else. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands that. So with that, Scott Jordan.
Madam Chair, can I ask that Mr. Gordon speak before I do?
Well, you sure may. You sure may.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that. For the record, Garrett Gordon. Tonight I represent technically Curtis and Judy Coulter. They lived on Rhodes Road, which is borders the property on its southern boundary. Lived there for about 20 years, 5-acre property, and in representing them, certainly there's been a little neighborhood group that's gotten together. These are complex issues, so I've tried to work with them and advise them to try to understand what's going on. And what we believe is going on is certainly removing this property from the sphere, from Reno's sphere of influence. And I would suggest to you that we look to Reno and Reno City Council specifically into what their position is of removing this sphere from their jurisdiction. And page 7, I know staff alluded to their position, but page 73 of your staff report says the City Council unanimously voted to not support the proposed regional plan amendment, but to support an effort of a joint plan or more detailed analysis during the regional plan update about the property's appropriateness in the city's sphere. The city expressed concern that removing this area from the city's sphere would eliminate the city's jurisdiction over the property, and it was unclear how issues such as community character, flood mitigation, Native American artifacts, and geothermal activity would be addressed in the future. So Reno still wants a seat at the table, and they're asking you, I believe, to recommend denial of this, because if you support this, it takes this property out of cooperative planning, and the ability to joint plan this would go away. I think one good example of why joint planning is important is I turn you to page 78 of the staff report, a memo from staff from City of Reno, where it states, the applicant is stating that the city's master plan designations are consistent with the city's, with the county zoning. This is not correct. That's not correct. While there is definitely some overlap, the city's master plan land use designation takes Steamboat Creek into consideration. So I'm sure this is one example of many of City of Reno considers Steamboat Creek and some development constraints. Washoe County, as far as their plan at this point in time, does not. To me, that's one example of probably many of why this area should be jointly planned. And one other note I would mention here is page 77 of the staff report, again by staff from the City of Reno. It says the applicant currently represents the opinions of many of the surrounding residents in the area. And let me just say that it is also incorrect in that we do not want to see this property leave the sphere. We'd like to see this jointly planned with input from both Washoe County and both Reno, given they both have a direct interest in this property. And we think we can all come up with something that works for everyone. So thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. And again, I'm going to have to reiterate that all that we are able to discuss today is the fact that we are moving it from the City of Reno into Washoe County. This is not a project, and if we want to discuss anything else, it has to be agendized. So with that, I will call it Mr. Jordan. Would you like to come up and speak?
Good evening. My name is Scott Jordan. I'm also here tonight to speak in favor of continuing this property in the cooperative planning status that it currently is in as an alternative to what staff is recommending. My wife and I live on the corner of Rhodes Road and Chance Lane in Steamboat Valley. We have 2 horses and 2 dogs. Our neighbor has 25 head of cattle. At the mailboxes last week was a notice that one of our neighbors had a missing goat. I'm telling you this so that you understand that Steamboat Valley is a rural area and we would like it to stay that way. The parcel of property in question has been carefully and thoughtfully zoned by county planners to recognize the transitional nature of the property. It has several different zoning designations from higher density in the northern part of the property to lower, more rural density in the south. This zoning is sensible and realistic and we would like to see it retained. Why are we worried about a possible zoning change? The current zoning includes 28.9 acres of low-density suburban zoning at the south end of this property. The zoning allows for 1 acre minimum lots. When the buyers of this property sought annexation in January of 2017, they proposed a zoning change to all but 4 acres of this area. The proposed zoning of SF6 would allow 7 lots per acre, or 230 small lots on what is currently low-density land. This proposed change on the south end of the property adjacent to Rhodes Road would affect many aspects of our rural lifestyle. We're not opposed to development of this property consistent with current zoning. We are opposed to zoning changes that would locate high-density housing at the southern rural end of this property, and we're also opposed to density transfers that would have the same effect. We hope that cooperative planning status, including both the county and the city, will assure that any development acknowledges the transitional nature of this location and honors and preserves our rural way of life. That's why I'm hoping that you will recommend to continue the cooperative planning status. And if a motion is necessary to that effect, I hope one of you commissioners will make it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Mike Rayleigh.
Good evening. For the record, Mike Rayleigh with Rubicon Design Group representing Teton Development Corporation, the project applicant. I think Lauren did a good job in kind of summarizing the history of this. And when we went through the City of Reno process, we had a couple of meeting with the Neighborhood Advisory Board, a noticed neighborhood meeting, as well as individual meetings with city council members. And we heard kind of over and over and over again, we do not want this to be developed in the city from the residents. We also heard from the city council members individually that there was no appetite for annexation of the property due to extension of city services to that area. And in fact, in speaking with Mr. Gordon, it was suggested that this property should be developed in the county. That was the wishes of the residents. So therefore, we withdrew our application for annexation and proceeded down that route, which is why we're here today. As noted by the chair and by Lauren, This does not request any change in land use. We plan in the future to come forward with a development proposal utilizing the existing zoning that's been in place for over 20 years. In terms of doing a joint plan or a cooperative plan, I think that kind of goes against what we heard originally, that why does the city need to have involvement? Not only to mention it's only a 67.5 acres of developable property. That's awfully a small parcel for a joint plan. If you look at what's been done in the past in terms of the size, like the Reno State Corridor Joint Plan, it takes in thousands of acres, for example. To joint plan one small piece of property, I don't think makes much sense from an overall land use perspective. So what we're really doing with this amendment is looking for a path to move forward. We've fallen into what I call a jurisdictional black hole. City of Reno has said, no, we don't feel the time is right to annex. You should go to the county. And so we need a path to move forward, and that's why we're here tonight. So I'm happy to address any questions you might have as well.
Mr. James, do you want to speak? You can check to speak. Okay, thank you. Are there any other requests to speak?
Yeah, I have one where Curtis Coulter.
Mr. Coulter?
Thank you. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you for taking your time away from dinner to hear us. I think as a matter of context, you heard Mr. Jordan speak about our request. Our request is to maintain the joint planning. This is a transition area, and the purpose of the transition is to have a transition from rural to urban. And how can you better do that than have the involvement of the city on the urban side and the county on the rural side? If this is put entirely into the county, then it allows for, potentially will allow for, the density transfer. And on this property, you're not aware there's a geothermal crust along the highway that's not buildable. There's the watershed that you did hear that is buildable. But I'm asking you if you'll please consider the request from Mr. Jordan to allow this property to be developed or reviewed on a joint basis. If you look back at the master plan, the South Valley's master plan, it gives some very interesting insight. It states the my fingers are fat and the pages turn slow. It said, the introduction, the South Valley Area Plan responds to a citizen-based desire to identify, implement, and preserve the community character that has evolved throughout the South Valleys over time. The South Valley's Area Plan implements and preserves this community vision and character. It respects the scenic and natural heritage of the area, maintains a rural agricultural character, and respects private rights. If we were to change what is currently zoned for 1 acre parcels to, which would put in about 40 parcels, up to about 230, it would completely decimate the transition zone. And that is why we are very sincerely asking that this parcel be jointly planned as it is now. As you heard, the city is opposed to it because the city wants to be involved in the transition. And we think that working together, these two entities have historically and would be consistent with this plan, which was negotiated, I believe, by James Hardesty through the litigation with the city, the county, and the city of Sparks. There's another issue that I'd like to bring to your attention on this parcel is to the east side, there's a hill that goes up, and that's currently zoned residential, community residential, neighborhood residential, and, neighborhood commercial. I believe, in speaking with John Rhodes, that Eric Young is aware that that may be a mapping error. In other words, there's no commercial use or exposure as you go east across Rhodes Road. So I think it may have happened when they went from the 2 maps to 1 map, and I would think it would be prudent to retain the joint planning so that error could also be picked up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lauren?
Madam Chair, I'd just like to make one clarification for the record. There is a difference between joint planning and cooperative planning. So joint planning is a process basically in which the two entities work together to create a master plan. It then is identified as a specific area within a regional plan. When anything is amended in that specific master plan or joint plan, basically it requires both planning commissions in both councils to have joint meetings and meet together and work through a process. In terms of cooperative planning, that's really a process set up where if a development application were to come through, say it was within City of Reno's boundary and a development application comes through and it's in cooperative planning, it would then be sent to Washoe County staff for comments and so that they can have some discussion about what can happen during that development process. So I just wanted to make that clarification. They are two different things in the regional plan.
Thank you. Are there any more requests to speak?
I have none at this time.
Anybody else? Okay, with that, I'm going to close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission. Comments? Commissioner Gower?
Madam Chair. Lauren, can I follow up on the last statement that you made? So understanding the difference between joint planning and cooperative planning, if this land was to transition to the county, does that preclude it from being part of the cooperative planning policies in the regional plan?
It does due to policy 1.2.17 of the regional plan, which basically says any lands added to Washoe County's portion of the TMSA after 2006 are not subject to cooperative planning. So it does due to that policy specifically.
Anybody else? Entertain motion.
Madam Chair, Commissioner
Commissioner
Weinstein, if I may, before
Of
a
course.
motion, and I'm prepared to make a motion, just for discussion
Yes.
purposes. I remember this project when it was brought before the Planning Commission of the City of Reno. And the discussions brought forward by the residents in the area. And like a lot of applications that are brought forth from the county to the city of Reno for their sphere of influence plays a part of it. We heard that the county residents didn't want City of Reno to be that night in chambers. And that's part of the reason why it's here tonight in a different form. Since then, I'm not sure what has taken place, but something has changed the minds of the residents. We wouldn't have all these chairs full, although it's nice at a regional meeting. But I still have heard concerns about zoning, but this is not zoning. This is not about a project. This is just whether or not the city of Reno is involved in hearing and offering advice and or planning to a Washoe County property and a property that is currently zoned in Washoe County. And none of that is changing. And as we heard tonight, it's the same thing that we heard in the city of Reno months ago. The zoning is not changing for what is being asked for, especially tonight when no zoning is being discussed. So with that, I'm prepared to make a motion unless somebody else has further discussion.
Is there any further discussion? Okay, Commissioner Weinstein.
Thank you. I move to approve RPC Resolution 18-01, providing a recommendation to the RPGB regarding an amendment to the Truckee Meadows Service Areas, TMSA, and the Cooperative Planning Area as indicated on Map 7, transferring 6 parcels totaling approximately plus or minus 83.03 acres from the City of Reno's portion of the TMSA to Washoe County's portion of the TMSA on a site located east of South Virginia Street, south of Town Drive, and north of Rhodes Road, as detailed in the staff report.
Commissioner Chesney, second.
Thank you. Okay, I have a first and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, thank you. Motion carries. Next, we're going to move along to E, presentation, consideration, and possible direction to staff regarding draft results, data gathering and assessment of regional stormwater GIS data.
Good evening. Jeremy Smith, GIS Coordinator with the Truckee Meadows Regional Planning Agency. For the record, my sincere apologies. We're having technical difficulties getting the projector to display on that wall. And honestly, this is a pretty visually oriented presentation, and the only place you're going to see it is on the screen. So at this time, it might be worthwhile to maybe try to hit that first light switch, which I'm hoping will turn off the bank of lights there. And then if you just want to turn around, like, there's no reason to look at me. And maybe folks want to come down here and sit in these chairs so you can see it easier now that they've cleared out. That might be wise. Yeah, you've seen enough of me anyway. Okay, so what I'm here today to talk to you guys about are draft results, and I call them draft results because we're in the process of finalizing a final report around what is phase one of a project that we were tasked by the Western Regional Water Commission to complete. So initially, I was asked by the WRWC to investigate, compile, and complete a GIS network describing stormwater conveyance in the Truckee Meadows. And baked into that is the concept that we do have a significant amount of GIS information that describing where we have stormwater conveyance infrastructure in our region. However, we also knew at the time that it was not complete. But no one had really done a holistic assessment to find out where it wasn't complete, right? What are we sort of missing? And so this is our attempt at that. I would say that after doing the assessment, I was probably overly optimistic that our agency would be able to complete the missing elements, but so we can get to that. So we were approved for funds for phase one, data gathering and assessment, and that's what we'll be looking at today. So here's our study area, which is based on hydro basins. So those, I believe it's 9 or 10 hydro basins, encompass the Truckee Meadows proper. The TMSA that we've been talking about would fit inside these hydro basins. It's actually larger than the TMSA, but we know that there are areas that are impacted by stormwater runoff that we need to maintain from that perspective. So we wanted to be as far-reaching as possible within reason. So we have the TMSA, we have Washoe Valley, and of course the adjacent northern valleys. And so those are areas that are outside the Truckee River drainage. I'm going to start with the answer that I got at the end, and then we'll tell you how we got there. This is the overview of all of the analysis we did to try to rank these basins in terms of completeness. And by completeness, I'm talking about not actually the completeness of the infrastructure on the ground, but the completeness to which we have been able to store it in the GIS and track it so that we can maintain and manage it. And hopefully one day in the future, perhaps use it as a method of modeling stormwater runoff, right, in advance of a storm event. So what you can see there is that really the Spanish Springs Valley has the most complete stormwater GIS data from our assessment, followed by both Lemon Valleys, west and east, then Washoe Valley. Sun Valley at the bottom is really Cold Springs, and also the Truckee Meadows proper has quite a few gaps, and we're going to zoom in and see exactly what that looks like. But here, how did we get to this, right? What do these numbers mean? We're going to get up there, so bigger is worse. What we have here is an evaluation grid, so this is kind of the approach. Obviously, we had to acquire all of the stormwater GIS data that's available from the jurisdictions that manage this. So City of Reno, Washoe County, City of Sparks, Sun Valley GID. We've spoken with NDOT. Anyone that with the flood project, anyone we can talk to that we think has GIS data, and we've acquired that data. And then this all sort of hinges on a very, I think it's an appropriate assumption, but it's an assumption. And that is that there is a relationship between the occurrence of development, where we develop things, and where we need stormwater conveyance features. If we have not developed an area, it's very unlikely that we would put in a tremendous amount of stormwater features, unless potentially that's leading to a development area and we need to manage that, or leading away from one. But this is the kind of the central premise of our analysis technique. To get to that, we created a quarter-mile analysis grid so that we could check in each and every grid a comparison between features that we know that describe development, things like dwelling units or business point locations, the existence of roads, paved roads, or building square footage from the assessor. We use that to compare to the stormwater data that we were able to acquire. And so we first, before we did anything super quantitative, we just got it all on a map, got it all together, and looked at it with imagery in the background, right? And these data features that I mentioned. So we had the housing points. That's what you see in the detail map at the bottom in orange, housing, dwelling units, the roads, and also we had the square footage. And we basically threw on imagery, and then the pink and purple are point features describing stormwater conveyance and line features. Then we did a visual assessment, and our intern, Tyler Smith, actually went through every grid square at least 3 times visually. So we wanted to make sure, we were giving it a good pass. And we came up with 3 ultimate categories from the visual assessment. That, number 1, it has stormwater data, and it appears to be sufficient to the development that we see in that quarter-mile square. Or that's the blue squares, you see it right. And then 2, the yellow squares, has stormwater data, but based on the visual assessment, does not seem sufficient, right? And you can sort of see that down in here. And I picked this point at random, but there's obviously something going on over here as far as housing units. There's some points, but there's no lines connecting them. It's not matching what we would expect to see. So it appears insufficient. And then finally, does not have any stormwater data present. Clearly there is development, and so it appears insufficient. And that's everywhere you see on this map, these gray boxes. So that was the first visual assessment, but of course, we wanted to be less subjective than that, and so we went to the quantitative assessment level. And here we really focused in on that relationship between where things are developed and how much stormwater data is there. And we cut up every single set of lines of stormwater data and all the points so that we had an accurate accounting per grid square of a number of development features and a number or length, let's say, of stormwater features. This is a very simplified example to give you the gist of it, but you can imagine in one of the square mile grids, we might have 47 housing units and there are 5 manholes, right? So that's a relationship between an amount of development and amount of stormwater GIS data. But then in another grid square, we might have 470 housing units, so an order of magnitude more, like quite a few more housing units, but the same 5 manholes. In our estimation, that is not a sufficient amount of stormwater data, right, to be describing what probably is actually on the ground in there. And so this is where you can see that the ratio values in orange below there, 9.4 versus 94. Now, the higher the ratio value of this comparison, the less complete we deemed that square to be with regard to how we're tracking GIS data. Not necessarily, again, remember, there may be absolutely adequate stormwater conveyance infrastructure on the ground there, but we're just looking at how well we're doing at inventorying that in a GIS. So the higher the ratio, the less complete. We examined 6 relationships quantitatively between stormwater data and development features. So, and I apologize, the fonts have changed magically on me here. But we looked at, as far as development features, from the assessor, building square footage. We looked at the length of roads. And we looked at the number of housing units and business points, so basically point measures. And then we compared those, as you can see these blue lines, to stormwater line features in that grid square. So that was 3 of the 6 comparisons. And then we also wanted to do that same check against stormwater point features, things like where the culvert maybe is or manholes, that kind of thing. These are probably ditches often and pipes, that kind of thing, that are moving the water around. There also are aerial or polygon stormwater features. However, they're fairly isolated in certain parts of the region, and so we didn't think it was appropriate to try to compare them holistically across the region, but as part of the report, we've compiled them, we're tracking them, they're mapped, and we'll be displaying them. So the results of all of these things then basically were averaged at this point. We have individual measures of each of those on each square, but to get a kind of a draft result picture, we decided to average each square, its ratio, to smooth it out to some degree. And in order to do that, we had to standardize the ratio values because they were often widely different depending on, comparing points to roads is very different than comparing the length of roads to the length of some sort of pipe or line feature. So everything was standardized so that we were looking at apples to apples and then averaged. And so what you can see here is The bluer the color of the grid square, the more complete that area is with regard to GIS stormwater features, going down to the very red squares where we have a lot of development, but we don't seem to have a commensurate amount of stormwater features available there. So this map, in some regard, can act as a prioritization guide of where we would want to go to the next phase, if approved by the WRWC or whoever might want to take on the next phase, and actually filling in the gaps of the data by going out in the field and capturing that. Now you might be asking, but Jeremy, you noticed that there were some squares that had no stormwater data, right? And that's in fact here in black. All of these squares have no stormwater data. But in thinking about that ratio graph that I showed you, there's something very different about having no stormwater data in a quarter-mile grid that has 1 home versus no stormwater data in a quarter-mile grid that has 500 homes, right? So it's not really apples to apples. So what we did is we took all the known points and we created a model curve, basically, that allowed us to go back and fill in those black areas based on what is developed there, sort of in a ratio sense, how I was using the word egregious is the lack of data in that square. And so that's how we got to that. It's kind of nifty. And we did that for all 6 comparisons. So back to the reprise of the results overview. We took all of those averaged squares and then we bundled them up by hydro basin, basically to get a feeling for what's the average of each hydro basin. And that's how we got this ranking. And I think you can see just from sort of looking at that map that we obviously have gaps in data in the Truckee Meadows, in Southwest, to West Reno. Also, we have gaps in data up in Cold Springs. There's not a tremendous footprint of development up here, but where we do have development, we don't seem to have done a very good job of capturing that infrastructure. So once again, there you go, there's the order. Finally, we didn't just look at those stormwater features. There was a whole host of other things we examined as well that, when I put this together, I only had a few minutes and I didn't want to go into detail on everything, but we looked at attribute fields, the fill rates of every single field and every single piece of stormwater data that got delivered to us, and what fields seem to be important and are in all of the data sets that we received, and which ones are one-offs that we probably don't need to be worried about. I mentioned the polygon features, we have that. We also looked at connectivity, because in the beginning we had this idea that perhaps we would actually be able to move water through these systems. And at this point I'm basically thinking of these data as a schematic view, because they are not connected in such a way at this time that you could do any sort of hydrologic modeling. But there are opportunities for topological connections. Topologies means how connected are things. Along jurisdictional boundaries, for example. You might have data from one jurisdiction that ends at their boundary and then could be picked up by another. We could look at snapping that together to make sure it's good. Likewise, NDOT has quite a few features just in a small buffer, maybe 60, 70 meters off of their major roadways that they maintain, where they have stormwater, but is it linked into the city or county systems? Not necessarily. So that's another opportunity for connectivity. And further, the next 2 hydrographic features, talking about streams, Thomas Creek, Whites Creek, that kind of thing. Often stormwater is conveyed into the streams and taken down. And likewise, irrigation ditches for that folks have had since the 1800s. Those can sometimes, not necessarily by design, but just sort of by default of where they are, also participate in the conveyance of stormwater, and that can be an issue. So we also have an evaluation of where that stands with regards to the data that we have. So this will all be contained in the final report. Also, some initial conclusions. Again, I mentioned this idea of a schematic view. I think there's a lot of work to be done to really, imagine that we could say a big rain event is coming and we'll be able to model what that will do to our system. But from that schematic view, so that we can actually maintain the system and be efficient about that, we really are about 60% of the way there in our region to having that level of coverage in a GIS. About 20% of the areas have no data that we were able to acquire at this time. And another 20% have data but seems incomplete. So that's kind of the overall picture. And I mentioned sort of the geographies of it, so we don't have to really belabor that point. Some next steps that we're involved in right now. We've been working to put together a very clean version of the data, centralized in our TMRPA data warehouse with a web page that will be password protected because these are infrastructure pieces. But basically, you'll be able to go there, see an online map of where the data is, these analysis grids, access to the final report. And there's this idea that, you have to maintain this stuff. What we've really done is benchmarked where we are today. And I know just by putting this out there, there will be folks that will say, but Jeremy, you're missing this, right? They have this and they'll give it to me and I can put that in there. And then as we go, we'll get to the actual pieces that we really just don't have. And then that sort of goes to the next slide here where, can I go to the second bullet actually? How are we gonna help, get public works staff together to help us to figure out how we're gonna go out in the field and collect that stuff that we really just don't have. We're doing the regional plan update, as you well know, and we only have so many people in our office, and it's hard to do everything. And I think we wanted to do some field verification during this project, and we just realized we just do not have the time to get out there. So we're going to have to work with the experts that really would be the ones that should be out there capturing this stuff on a GPS anyway, to get that done in what could be contemplated as a phase 2 if funded. And then lastly, up above there, we're collaborating. We're bringing this information to bear with several initiatives that are happening right now. One is the One Truckee River 2018 Action Plan, where I'm sitting on the Stormwater Vegetation and Watershed Management Group, discussed with them. We're bringing the data to bear there. Regional Watershed Management Plan Update, that's an initiative that's being done by the City of Reno and I believe Stantec. And Terry Svedich, who used to work at City of Reno and really knows about this stuff. So they're really looking at the hill slopes, the hillsides, and where stormwater is coming in. So it's a really nice fit with what we did, looking at the development areas. And finally, we have been tasked and we've ventured into a contract with RCI, funded by the Nevada Department of Environmental Protection, to help them look at GIS around source water protection. And this is the idea that TOMA does an amazing job, I think, of making sure that our water is clean and it's delivered. But there are other water purveyors. We heard about one today down in the Steamboat area. There's several wells that are out there. And so what we're trying to do is prop up some informational map viewers that allow planners to know the locations of these wells so that they can consider that in development review, basically. And what's great is that some of the monies that WRDPC gave us to complete this project, we're already leveraging to do this source water stuff. So the intern we had, that expired, but now he's on this one. We were able to get an upgrade to a GIS license that allows him to access our centralized database and also a laptop. So we're using all that stuff to continue to move forward to try to provide more information to folks so that we make better decisions. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Let everybody get back up here. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Chesney.
What is your confidence level in the data that you've accumulated to this point?
Well, I think I have high confidence in those areas, about 60% of the areas that we have achieved a schematic view of how water is conveyed. And in terms of modeling, it's similar to what we might do with transportation right now, the level we're at with transportation modeling. So if we do transportation demand modeling with the RTC, it's not going house by house by house and pretending that this house has 2 cars and they're going to do their job. It's really with traffic analysis zones, and those feed into the network, into the regional road network. I would say we have at least that or better schematic view of the stormwater data, but we don't have captured our sort of, I was calling them curb sheds or curb and gutter sheds, right? Where water falling would lead into a certain area. That work will remain to be done. That doesn't exist.
Well, my concern is that, we've got the Limit Valley issue for sure.
Yes.
But the potential of Stonegate, and this data could be used either to substantiate issues in those areas or can be used to reduce the task force. And so really, if we're going to publish this data, we're going to be darn sure that it is accurate.
I totally agree, and I feel that way about absolutely everything that we try to do. 100%. And
I'm not hitting on you.
Of course.
I'm just saying that this could be explosive 2 ways.
I agree, and Cold Springs does pop as sort of the worst basin with regard to GIS coverage. Now, again, this is not, we're not saying that there isn't stormwater conveyance features out there on the ground, because we just don't know that, and the imagery is not fine resolution enough to see that. but we're taking the data that's available and trying to see how it corresponds to where we know there's development. And to that end, I think, I have a lot of confidence that we've done a very robust examination of that.
Thank you, you've got a lot of hard work in this, for sure.
Any other questions?
Madam Chair, quick question.
Yes, Commissioner
Jeremy, how do you account, or how does this account for features like LIE that may not necessarily be lines on the map or polygons?
Please, what's LID?
It will impact development stormwater features. So, I mean,
It hasn't in any way even tried to. There was no data received describing LID, but now that you've mentioned it, I think we'll need to look into it. The data we received was mainly points, lines, and polygons, GIS type data, right? And so that would be an area for investigation, is how we capture those LID portions. And, we contemplated in the initial, because I had pie in the sky ideas in the beginning of this that, oh, sure, we can fill it in and we're going to calculate all this stuff. And it's much more difficult than I imagined. But, impervious surface is also a very important component of any of this, as is, I had contemplated looking at the hillside contribution areas, because that's been a criticism I've heard from staff at some places where, we measure the contaminant level of a stormwater, say, outfalling to the river, but we don't have a very good understanding of what might be driving that, where it's coming from. So those issues are, I think, down the line in what we need to do, because really we need to make sure that we have accurately captured all the things that we actually have, on the ground. So we're outside of the area.
great job.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, great job, thank you, and I'm relieved to know that you're gonna work with the other jurisdictions so that they understand, so that they can plug in as they're sitting making decisions about
Absolutely.
development and where it needs to go, so thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate your hard work.
Thank you.
Right, next we have reports, members and directors report, regional plan update.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. A couple of quick updates. The last time we got together was actually with the regional plan update consultants, and that was in late November. Since that time, we have finished interviewing the governing board members and ensured that we've spoken to all of the regional planning commissioners as well. The scope of work is almost complete. We have that scheduled to go before the working group, the staff working group, next week. In addition to that, Mike McKeever, who used to run the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, he's part of the consultant team that we hired for the regional plan update. He's coming next week for a day and a half to work with us. We're going to take him on a tour. He's asked to really get a good lay of the land, so we're probably going to spend about half a day touring him around to various places. And we have a extended session with the staff working group scheduled the next day, and also some work time for us internally as well. So those are our next steps that are happening right now. I'd also like to announce that next week we are launching our second survey, and it is about quality of life. And so we will be putting that out. We'll be letting you know that that's out there. And just like before, we'll ask you to please take the survey, share it with your friends and family. Anybody you can get to take it, we would really, really appreciate that. So that is the update on the update. Okay. Additional items. Madam Chair, I'd like to also discuss our next meeting, which is February 14th, 2018. We have taken a look at our calendars and recognized that while there are quite a few items coming forward in the next few months, the timing, we don't actually have items for February. So our suggestion to you is to actually cancel the Valentine's Day meeting. I know that we talked about spending it together, and so, we can certainly try and work something to do on Valentine's Day.
Totally spoiled my plan.
We could certainly, pull something together if that's your request. That would make our next meeting March 14th, and our expectation is actually we'll be reviewing the city's regional master plan. So we are looking for direction from the planning commission. If canceling Valentine's Day meeting is okay, you can certainly send you an email. Okay, does everybody agree with that?
So moved.
Okay. Okay. Madam Chair, that's it for me.
Okay, legal counsel's report.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Jessica Prenti for the record. I'm pleased to report that I have nothing to report on the legal part.
Yay, thank you. with that, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Move on adjourn.
Sorry, Madam Chair.
Oh,
Madam Chair, we still have public comment?
oh, I apologize. I mixed up my pages, so yes, I have public comment. Does anybody wish to speak at the end? Come on, Mr. Edwards, I'll let you. Do we have any written correspondence?
We do not.
Okay, great. Now I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Okay, thank you. We're adjourned.